We first have Lynly Edges, Legal Director for the Transgender Law Center, pronouns she and her. Chauncey McGlathery, pronouns he, him, Sexual Justice Coordinator for the Sero Project. Ashunte Coleman, pronouns she, her, co-founder of LIPS Tampa. Tiffany Moore, pronouns she, her, Council of Justice Leaders and member of, are part of the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. And then completing our superstar panel is Monica Jones, pronouns she, her, of the Outlaw Practice and Best Policy Practice. We will have people monitoring the chat on Facebook live as well as on Zoom. So feel free to drop questions, comments, shout outs, whatever you feel, whatever's in your heart into that. And we will answer them as they come up. Yeah, so first, I wanted to do a little introductory explanation about who HMP is. I know a lot of y'all this may be your first interaction, hopefully not your last, with the Health Not Prisons Collective. So we're going to share some slides just to go over that a bit.
One second.
Cool. All right. Once again, this is Let's Talk About Sex. What a great title for a great presentation. I'm so excited. Click, go ahead. So the Health Not Prisons Collective is a national initiative. It's a collection of 5 national partners: the Counter Narrative Project, the Positive Women's Network, the Sero Project, Transgender Law Center, and the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. Click. And we are an intersectional national initiative launched in 2020. And we're longtime collaborators led by, accountable to, communities most affected by HIV criminalization in the United States. Our strategy incorporates education and training, grassroots and grass tops organizing, policy analysis and advocacy, legal intervention, and narrative change, designed to shift the focus about HIV risk, blame, responsibility, and the role of the carceral state, including detention, centering racial justice and gender justice. So, you know, a light lift. Go ahead and click. These are our community principles, and we are very much grounded. All of our work, no matter what it is grounded in these principles. They include community power and meaningful involvement of people living with HIV, transforming balance of power, vision and strategic practices of abolition and harm reduction, racial justice, bodily autonomy and reproductive justice, disability justice, healing justice and access, economic justice, and narrative and media justice. Click. And throughout our work, we've been able to accomplish quite a lot. Once again, we just started in 2020. And so already we have kind of made a lot of really exciting things come to light. We first have the Health Not Prisons Dispatch, and this is a shameless plug, but go to the link at the bottom of the page you see here, and please sign up, because a lot of work and love goes into it, and you can stay connected to all that we're getting done. The Positively Trans Project is another another success of the Health Not Prisons Collective. We've done quite a bit to influence the federal response to HIV, and that includes influencing and testifying before federal bodies such as PACHA, and providing commentary and strategic planning around the National Strategic Plan. Next slide. Another really great success in the center of this slide, you'll see the Demanding Better HIV Federal Policy Agenda, which is the first policy agenda written by and for people living with HIV, which enumerates the priorities of people living with HIV and strategies for truly ending the epidemic and increasing the quality of life of people living with HIV into the future. We also have a number of publications that have started thanks to Health Not Prisons, the HIV Criminalization National Survey, which the Sero project is running, is open and accepting responses that will hopefully inform future action. And then also the HIV is Not a Crime National Training Academy, which happened in June of this year and will happen again next year. I think that's our last slide. Next slide. Yeah, I think that's our last slide. Okay, so now to the good stuff. We are going to get into some questions. One of the things I think is important when having this conversation is to really ground us in what are we even talking about? I know sex work is something that's often discussed in the public light, but we really want to be sure we're all using the same terminology. So Lynly, I was hoping we could turn to you to describe what the difference between sex work and sex trafficking is.
Absolutely, thanks so much. I'm going to utilize a definition that was created by many colleagues of mine, and a lot of time and thought went into this. So a big thank you to the work that it took to get to this definition. So a broad definition of sex work could be the exchange of money or goods for sexual services, either regularly or occasionally, involving adults, young people, children, where sex workers may or may not be doing the work because consciously define the activity as income gathering. It could be formal, it could be informal, it could be temporary, it could be in exchange for food, for shelter, for protection, for survival, and it can be voluntary. It can be the only option someone has as for a job. So people are engaging in it by choice. It can be also based on circumstances. It also can be coerced. So it can also be, people can be forced or coerced or defrauded into it. And I think it's really important for us to ground ourselves in the definition that sex work is labor. Sex work is work like any other form of work. And the reason it's so important for us to really ground ourselves in that is because when we're talking about human trafficking is when someone, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, is induced into any form of labor. It is not just about people who are forced, coerced, or defrauded into sex work. It is trafficking impacts every single type of labor in the world. And I really raise that up because when we are so specific and we just talk about sex, even though we are just talking about sex today, sometimes we forget that sex work is just another form of labor that people can engage in for a variety of different reasons. Now, what's trafficking? It's important to know that when we look at what trafficking is, we look at either the federal definition or the definition of the state that we're in. In general, I use the federal definition. As an attorney, A, it's what I've been using for almost 15 years now, and B, I actually think it does a good job of describing what it is. And basically, it's exactly what I just said. It's when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. That's pretty much it. There is one exception. Under the law, under federal law, not state law, under federal law, when someone is younger than 18 and engaging in any type of commercial sex, right? Commercial sex is that exchange of money or goods for sexual services. That person is considered a trafficking victim. This definition is a little confusing is because in general, states who are able to create their own laws around sex work and what is legal and illegal actually still criminalizes people who are younger than 18 who engage in sex work by putting them in juvenile detention facilities, by putting them in prisons, sending them to foster care, which is another form of prison for many people, for residential treatment centers. So it is a little confusing when we hear the federal government saying, actually, there is this person who's younger than 18 engaging in sex work is a victim no matter what. And then we have the state saying, actually, we're actually going to treat this person in a way that puts them in jail and tells them and punishes them. So I think it's just important to hold both of those things because they don't make sense and they don't connect to each other, which I'm going to be honest, y'all, as a lawyer, I see this all the time where definitions don't always make sense. But if we can think of sex work just as any other form of labor, it's really easier to understand that people can be forced, coerced, or defrauded into any form of labor. I'm going to take one more minute to talk a little bit about what force, fraud, and coercion is. Force is easy. It's physical. It's a little bit easier to understand. It's when someone either threatens to harm you or actually does harm a person to induce them to engage in sex work. Fraud is a little bit more confusing, and we don't actually often see it come up that much when we're looking at this type of work, but it's when someone is tricked into engaging in an activity that they didn't want to do. Coercion is a lot more complicated. And the way I like to think about coercion is I think about what would happen if someone said no. If someone says, you have to do this, and if you don't do it, something bad is going to happen to you. If that something bad is enough to make me think, oh, I need to do this, someone's going to harm my child if I don't do what this person is saying, if I don't bring home a certain amount of money, if someone is holding a child hostage. I'm not sure why I'm sticking to the child example right now, because it's not just about children. It's I am going to not let you eat. I have full control over every aspect of your life, and I'm not gonna let you eat. I'm gonna out you as trans to your family, and I know that if I do that, you're gonna experience violence. So in order for me not to out you, you have to go and do sex work or any form of labor, and that way I will not out you. So it's important that coercion looks different for different people. It is not a it's not a one size fits all. Not that I ever think anything really is these days, but it's more of just it's a personal thing that's going to impact someone personally, that is going to get them to engage in the form of labor that the person who is coercing them wants them to do. And if anyone ever has questions about coercion or any of this, I'm happy to talk more about that.
Thank you for that. I think it's super important that we're all, on the same page. And every time I hear you speak, Lynly, I learn a new definition. So I'm always appreciative of that. I am hoping that we can actually open this up to some other folks. Tiffany, when you were introducing yourself earlier, hearing your background makes me think that you might be a good person to talk about what are we really discussing when we say decriminalization of sex work. Do we have like a shared definition of what justice or what the end goal of decriminalizing sex work would look like?
For me, it's empowerment. It allows that time and space to separate the sex work from the sex trafficking, because it allows law enforcement to focus on those being abused, coerced, money taken, and it allows. And sex workers stick together. They don't tolerate that. I mean, who's your business? Who are you seeing? I mean, there's rules in the background. And I know quite a few times, we came across those on different levels that were being forced. And we're like, hey, wait a minute, when we could speak up. So it's really empowering, decriminalizing sex work. It's putting the health back in our position, because then we're not forced to have to do that sexual encounter without a condom. We're allowed to use condoms. We're allowed to say no, because you know what, you didn't take a shower and I'm not really liking this situation. But criminalizing it forces it more underground, which allows for the more street level underground control. And it turns into more survival and trying to dodge. You're constantly dodging, which puts you into more dangerous situations and not being able, your mindset changes to where you're not in that mindset to be able to make those safe choices. So keeping sex work criminalized, and there's no point in having a prostitution charge that also just alerts employers and housing, causes for more abuse, causes for more, oh, well, I guess I can get a blowjob or something out of this one. And people don't think of that, but that really happens. So decriminalizing it's going to get power. It's so much, especially for the South, is more on the religious Bible Belt. Like, we're going to open up brothels on every corner. And that's not what this is. It's going to happen regardless. Sex work is the oldest. It's labor, it's work. It's no different than working in retail, and placing that empowerment back in the hands of men and women to be able to do that work just shifts the focus. And
I just want to add a little bit to what Tiffany said, because I think it's so important that people actually hear that one of the ways to actually end human trafficking is to decriminalize sex work, to remove all criminal penalties for selling and buying sex work. And just like what Tiffany said, it's once someone has, I always say, how do we make the perfect trafficking victim into commercial sex? And one of the ways is we criminalize them. We put their names and their faces on Facebook or whatever it is that police often do these days. Then we give them criminal convictions so they might be stigmatized from their family, unable to get other jobs. How perfect is it for a trafficker to be like, who can I take advantage of? How can I make it so this person actually can't get another job because they keep getting these convictions on their record? And if we really, there's a lot more to my how to make a perfect trafficking victim, but it's all tied to criminalization. And if we really care about trafficking victims, the best way to get trafficking victims out of the situations they're in is just what Tiffany said. So many people who I've worked with who are survivors of trafficking left because sex workers helped them leave. Because who has the most access to people who are being trafficked into commercial sex? The two groups of people, number one, are sex workers. We already know that that group of people are helping people leave and doing it regularly. And I've seen that for a very, very long time. The second, and I get a lot of questions about this, why don't we just criminalize clients? No, for so many reasons, we shouldn't criminalize clients. And if all we care about is helping survivors of trafficking leave, we need to remember that the second group of people who are most likely to help trafficking victims are clients themselves. Clients often help trafficking survivors leave. So the more we criminalize anyone in this situation, the worse it's going to be for survivors of trafficking. And it really just focuses too much on providing money and finances to the police, to anyone who's really just trying to criminalize people for actually just trying to support themselves and survive.
Hi everyone, I'm Ashunte, and I have to interrupt on this. I was a street-based sex worker at 17 until my later years in life. And every time I caught a prostitution charge, the police would pull up, snatch me out the car, let the judge, while I sit my ass in jail for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, up until the time I went to prison. So that's to me, because if I'm getting charged, back then, if I was getting charged with prostitution, the judge should have got charged 12 in my book. And when you speak of trafficking, it's not just kids alone. I don't want that narrative being pushed into our community because it's not about kids. These Asian people that came over here that was working in these stuff, they weren't kids. The people that they have been busting, they weren't kids, and they're targeting traffic victims, of course, but I am from the sex working industry. So a lot of your narrative to me does not make any sense.
Yeah, so I appreciate you sharing. Ashunte, you were cutting in and out a little bit, I think, your reception, but we would love to hear more about, sorry, go ahead.
I'm on the interstate and I am going in and out. I'm sorry, y'all.
That's all right. We hope that, you can get to some strong service because we really do want to hear everything that you have to share. I was hoping in the interim, Monica, would you be able to talk about what good policy to support sex workers would look like? I know you are joining us from the outlaw practice and best policy practice. So just asking if you have any ideas about what successful practice to support sex workers would be.
So when we talk about, I want to get back onto the decrim to usher into the policies, right? And so when we talk about decriminalization, what we really mean is to stop the interactions that sex workers have with the police, right? And when we know that being Black or being a person of color, and especially being a trans woman, the interactions that we have with the police are worse than what we have with the clients or anything else. And so when we look at countries that decriminalize sex work, what they do, especially in New South Wales in Australia, which is where Sydney is, they have these workers' rights for sex workers. As a sex worker, I have workers' rights. I have labor rights, right? And so if I'm working in a brothel, that means the brothel has to have health codes up to fire access and everything else. That means if I'm a street-based sex worker, that means there's a certain area that I can work and have access to condoms and everything else. That means if I get assaulted by a client, I can file a police report and not be seen as less in. And so that's what decriminalization really means. It means taking the power out of the state and giving autonomy to sex workers, right? Giving legitimacy to our form of work. And given, if you are a teenager engaging in sex work, you have access to services. And many times that teenagers engage in sex work is as a last resort. But when we understand that like people are dealing with hurt because of the trauma that society places on being trans, being a sex worker. And sometimes when you look at trans people, sex work is the only option, the best option that sex workers have as a legitimate form of work, right? We make way more than what we be doing flipping burgers. We are not stigmatized when we are engaging in sex work, right? Because if I'm working at McDonald's, then I'm a sightseer for everyone else who wants to come in and bully me as working at McDonald's. But as a sex worker, it gives me legitimacy and access to money that I would not have. And when we talk about policies that protects sex workers, we want to talk about the violence that sex workers face all across the board, especially Black trans women, right? And so having policies that protect us and recognize our legitimate form of work is very important. So when we talk about like these policies that using condoms as evidence, like in New York City and like here in Arizona, where we had those ordinances that said, if you are a woman and you have condoms, we can use that as a form to prove that you were engaging in sex work. And it's manifestation charge, loitering with the intent. And moving those things out of the way so trans women have the right to engage in safe sex practices without being criminalized for engaging in sex work. But also it's a double-edged sword because if you, in some states still, we are criminalized. If we are HIV positive, we still face charges and stricter charges because we engage in sex work. And decriminalization, especially like in New South Wales, when you are a person who is positive and you engage in sex work, before they had this law where you had to tell your client that you were positive and they had to consent, right? But now, as long as you reduce all harms, not all harms, but reduce the risk by using condoms, making sure everything is good, then you don't have to tell your partner, your client, right? And so with decriminalization, it reduces the stress on the individual and puts it on everyone to be respectful. Not just the sex worker, but it's on everyone, right? To respect our bodies, to respect our boundaries. We can go file a report if we face violence, right? And so that's what I want to talk about, these policies and like how policies directly, like recommendation 86, that the United Nations, that people made from best practices and other organizations said, hey, United Nations, give this recommendation. And Uruguay, a country, said, US, you have to reduce the harms that sex workers face. And the US accepted that recommendation 86, and that's very important. And that was given by best practices.
Thank you.
I don't know if that fixed up everything.
No, that was great. And actually offered way more than I think my question was asking. So that was very helpful. And I want to talk more about being a person living with HIV and the intersections of HIV criminalization and sex work criminalization, which you started to talk about, Monica. So thank you very much. Chauncey, I was wondering if you could offer from the Sero project, just how does sex work decriminalization and HIV decriminalization intersect? Or have you seen it intersect in your work?
I have seen it intersect. They kind of go together naturally, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the criminal justice system that we have is as imperfect as our legislators and our law enforcement officers. We live in a layered society, and we have a history that is well known and well documented. So anytime you're dealing with layers of oppression, whether it be race or gender or sex or orientation, these further complicate and create great opportunities for oppression, for harm, for manipulation. So all of these things that we're talking about, they all intersect because there are certain populations that are more prone to be exploited than others. And a lot of times people on the street, not just customers, but people on the street, law enforcement officers, will take advantage of those opportunities. And I think it's really, really important that we don't forget the fact that we're not okay, but for sex work decriminalization and HIV decriminalization. This is just a further exacerbation of a human rights and civil rights problem. So that is part of the overlap. I'm hoping that you're also going to ask me about some of how these states have responded, but I may have jumped the gun. That was a question that I was expecting.
Yes, so I do want to discuss like where the movement is at. So yeah, take it away, Chauncey.
Sure. I'll start by talking about Texas. Actually, Texas, like Tennessee, have taken steps backward. They are not moving in the direction that the advocates would like them to move, or the sex workers. You will hopefully hear me say that the best advocates for better laws and decriminalization around sex work are the sex workers themselves. There are those of us who have the privilege of coming alongside and assisting and facilitating, but these people who have the daily interaction are the authority, and they are the best advocates. And the states that are doing the best are those that are led by sex workers themselves. And so Missouri is one of those examples. They actually started a study and actually had 157 sex workers give information, because a lot of the problems, sometimes states say that they don't know enough about what's actually going on. And so Missouri is one of those states that has taken the lead in identifying sex work as work itself, which sounds like it shouldn't need to be said, but because of the complicated history that I was referring to earlier, I think it's important. I think we also need to talk about the fact that historically the states have thought very archaically about sex work. And in the language, prostitution is the term that most of us are familiar with. Solicitation, of course, would be also one of those terms. You could be arrested for criminal trespass, right? Disorderly conduct, right? There are so many ways to be caught into a system for sex work that are not even on their face sexual violations. So I think it's really, really important. Some of the things that they found in Missouri, where sex work is work, sex workers are experiencing adverse access to healthcare. So Missouri is working on that. And as I mentioned, there are outdated laws on the books. New York City, I think, is an important place to talk about, because they are experiencing what we're experiencing in this call. Actually, there is a movement for sex workers to advocate for themselves. Walking While Trans is one of the names of the legislation that has been successfully overcome. There was a woman there who the police would literally follow her around the city. She actually got pulled over on a bus once and pulled off to be arrested just because of who she was, what she was wearing, and where she went. That's called Walking While Trans, and several states have recognized that problem, and the city has overturned that law. But the state has not been as progressive. There's an organization of sex workers and advocates called Decrim New York, which is made up of more than 20 current and former sex workers, allies, and organizational partners. And they want to make the sex trade no longer criminalized. And the name of their bill that they are proposing is the Stop the Violence in the Sex Trade bill. This was created by Assemblyman Gottfried and Senator Salazar. This bill aims to decriminalize the industry, including sex workers, clients, and managers, while also carefully protecting minors and trafficked people. So New York is attempting to walk a balance, which I think is what a lot of the states are going to do. I want to mention California because they have a Safer Streets for Sex Act. This bill will replace the existing state law that now allows for targeted discriminatory policing of communities of color. And I think, again, we need to think about these as policing issues as well as legislative issues. This was introduced by Senator Weiner. This bill amends Section 1 of the Evidence Code, adds a section and repeals 2 sections of the Penal Code, amends a section of the Public Utilities Code, and amends 2 sections of the Welfare and Institutions Code. So here is a perfect example of how intricate some of these state laws are. This one act to make safer streets for sex requires us to go into 5 different areas of the law because they have all been gathered in order to give police ammunition to stop those who they believe are engaged in sex work. Massachusetts has a similar bill as New York. The organization sponsoring it is Decrim MA. They helped introduce 2 Decrim bills in the state legislature. Oregon has a new Decrim bill introduced, as well as Louisiana. So here again, I was just trying to give a survey of what has been happening in the states. And as you can see, all of the states that I mentioned that are successful in their endeavors are being led by an advocacy group of sex workers. You cannot successfully decriminalize sex work legislation without having sex workers themselves at the table speaking about their own experiences.
I'm definitely glad you re-uplifted that last point because the wonderful, opportunity that we're having right now to discuss this. The panel of superstars that you see before you also has personal experience in doing just that, leading and advocating from lived expertise. And so I want to talk more about the state of the current movement. Ashunte, if you are able to talk, would love to hear what LIPS Tampa is doing as far as advocacy. And also Tiffany, I know that you've done work advocating around laws here in the South, and would love to hear some of your personal experience about, the state of play. So I guess we can start with Tiffany.
So for Tennessee, in 2015, I was able to draw awareness around HIV criminalization, and the legislation committee was willing just to pick up pieces of it. In my journey through that, there were senators that wouldn't even shake my hand. So stigma runs still the education of passing. So it was excitement that they were willing to at least touch on one point. So they did look at the prostitution and they started reviewing the sex offender registration, because in the state of Tennessee, if you are HIV positive and you're convicted, you are placed on the sex offender registration. You don't want to find yourself ever on that registry, and it makes absolute no sense for public health, because the years and the amount of charges that I got were as a result of no housing. You can't get in halfway houses, employment, rehabilitation services, is just all mute. So it was exciting that they were willing to look at it. So we did get past the bill, but if anyone knows how judicial committees work, you have original language written in, you know, your ways, and it's totally flipped in the end. And that's what happened. It did end up being an amendment to the registry, which allows those of us to petition the court if we can prove rape, domestic violence, trafficking, or any coercion during the years. So that was a little bit of level that the state recognized. They all recognized it shouldn't be on the registry. However, the South is not just going to make a law go away. It's so easy to put a law on the book. It's so hard to take it off. So currently right now we're going back to the table and starting over, scratching and bringing in a whole HIV modernization movement to cover in general, to relieve, because the problem with Tennessee is the sex offender registration. That is huge. It's just, they use it and say, because we're a public health concern, not realizing that they're actually causing the public health concern by doing that. So we hope with the drafting right now that we have going, that the ball gets rolling for 2022. But in my experience, I believe legislation's open to it. There's just so much stigma that the problem is education. The problem is updating them with U equals U. It kind of just shocks me, because I gave birth to a child in 2014, and I carried my child for 9 months, gave vaginal delivery. She's negative, but I wasn't criminally charged. So they recognize the science, but yet they criminalize, in a sense, the same thing that got you pregnant, which doesn't even pass the virus, even in that sense. So it's really starting to bring all that education to them and get that awareness, but it's the stigma. It's the stigma and those 80s, that mind frame. I forgot the technical name of the fear of HIV. And it's real. You know, they think they can catch it just by breathing in the same room. So that's the history with Tennessee. It's just that stigma is so embedded. And so is the community. I would love to see more billboards, U equals U in Tennessee. I think that would shock Tennesseans when, you talk about it. So hopefully this 2022, we'll get something on the table, working towards a full, at least level down and take a lot of because our laws are so straightforward. There has to be no intent, no transmission has to occur, just being HIV positive in the state of Tennessee. And I would say 95%, no, I would say 100% are all from police stings. So it's not a sex worker actually transmitted to a client. It was all stings. All police stings were set up and we were targeted. So that we're hopefully going to get that looked at as well.
Thank you. And I hear you that misinformation is it's actually mind-blowing sometimes, the stigma and the lack of information that folks have. If you wouldn't mind, can you explain U equals U for anyone who's joining the call that may be unfamiliar about the progression of science around HIV?
Yeah, the reason I gave vaginal delivery. So U equals U meaning usually takes about 6 months. Everybody's body's different. It could take someone a year, 2 years. Please know HIV is different for everybody, but it's typically within immediate getting on care. But taking our medication and having an undetectable viral load, which that as well can be different, but 25 copies, 50 copies, it would depend on the lab. But your doctor would let you know. We cannot pass HIV. So HIV cannot be transmitted sexually at all when you're undetectable, and women can carry children to HIV positive, can have a child. We are no different than the rest of society. Yeah, I mean, we might glow green at night. I'm not sure. I'm joking. That was harsh humor there. But I mean, I feel sometimes that's what is thought of, but we're no different than the rest of society. It's that stigma I remember being in elementary school and having somebody come and they had like hundreds of meds. And I remember him looking so sickly. That's the image America has of people living with HIV. And that's not what it is. We cannot transmit the virus. I have great health. I mean, I'm very lucky that, I mean, I see people, I follow on TikTok, some people in hospice care, you know, their last breaths with cancer, and that's scary. You know, HIV, I'm very lucky, and I can't transmit the virus, but yet I'm criminalized.
Yeah, I appreciate you uplifting the fact that criminalization is a disruption to health services for people. And so it's very, they work against each other. To say criminalization helps address public health concerns is inaccurate. Ashunte, I would love to hear from you about the work that you do in Florida and the state of play in yet another red state for sex work decriminalization.
Okay, so currently LIPS is under restructuring, and we're not a part of the political movement, because just getting those girls to come out and support and be loving towards one another is a challenge. Recently, I started working for SWAP. I was working for SWAP already, but I became a part of the syringe exchange, the underground syringe exchange that we have. I'm one of the outreach coordinators that go and bridge the gap with the Tampa syringe exchange, trying to prevent overdose, because I passed out Narcan, and I passed out clean syringes to keep my participants from passing HIV or Hep C. One of the things that we were looking at as far as decrim of sex work, we decrim of sex work and HIV, we tacked on a bill, not last year, but year before last, with an organization. And they got all our data, because SWAP, again, is small. We're big, but we're small. They got all our data. They got everything that they needed. And we were supposed to collaborate with them on the bill. But when the bill turned to be, which was kind of hurtful and made us kind of distrustful at this point. I mean, there's conversations right now. Well, we could a bill.
I think we are breaking up connection again, Ashunte. We have dropped in the chat more information about SWAP and LIPS Tampa for folks, and I'm hoping we can hear the rest of your comments soon.
Okay.
I was hoping we could talk about how folks can get connected to the work. I think part of Ashunte's comments made me think how sex workers oftentimes are connected to a lot of different movements, like harm reduction has been mentioned, you know, disability justice, honestly, is intersecting with the HIV decrim and sex work decrim movements. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities personally for folks to get involved in the work, but I'd love to hear from some of y'all experts here about how do we push the world towards sex work decriminalization, but even beyond that, how do we support sex workers? And I want to start with Monica.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of things you can do. You can support our organizations, so you can support the movement. And so one of the ways that people can get involved is just by following our organizations on Twitter or on Instagram, seeing our work and what we do. And one of the things that I'm gonna put in the link is the link to Sharma's Outlaw's report that she did before she passed away. And this is a report that she talked about, HIV policy, sex work, and all these things back in 2015 before she passed away. And so you can go to Best Policy Practice and read the report, Sharma's report. But a lot of things is like what organizations really do need, especially grassroots organizations, is we need donors. We need those grassroots donors, those individual donors that can donate long term to organizations, especially organizations who are out there doing syringe exchange, doing condoms and passing out condoms and giving out test kits and everything else, and know your right pamphlets. Those things are very important. So the main reason how you can support our work is become a donor, become a or share our work and on your feed and say, this is a great organization, look into this organization. And so I find that the main thing that people can do is just talk about us, share our work, invite us to speak at things like this and everything else. And so that's what I'm going to end at.
Thanks. I want to turn it to Lynly. Do you have any additional ways that people can get connected to the work?
Just uplifting everything Monica just said. The other thing is I think people need to speak up when they hear misinformation out there about sex workers, about clients of sex workers. When they hear people conflating trafficking and sex work, I think it's really important that people speak up and actually say that's not true. And, you know, when people are saying anything that is negative, you know, when we stay silent, silent is consent to some extent. When we stay silent, it means that we might agree with what that person is saying. So I just also encourage people to speak up. And if you don't have all the information, to educate yourself.
I appreciate that. Chauncey, you listed off a bunch of states that are moving legislation. Do you see, you know, I guess, what are ways that folks can get connected in their own states to the work that's moving?
Yeah, that's great. And that's exactly what I was going to say. There is someone in every state working on this issue. And I would, this is what I had to do, look for the sex workers who are organized in your state. Subscribe to their newsletter. Follow them on social media. Retweet messages that are impactful to you. And then I think also it's important to not be an enemy of sex workers. Do not, and you may be doing this and have no idea, but going back to Lynly's point, conflating human trafficking with sex work, one of the biggest opponents to decriminalization of sex work are the people who think they're doing good opposing human trafficking. That's where most of the energy is coming from. And legislating morality has never worked, and it never will. Just because you are advocating for sex workers to become successful or access care that they need and to stay safe on the street doesn't mean that you're hoping that the whole world becomes sex workers as their primary source of income. Just because you are not living in opposition of a group doesn't mean you are wearing a banner on your chest saying that this is the way you would choose to live if you were in those same circumstances. Just don't be a problem for people who are trying to make progress for people. Because if one thing the pandemic has shown us, that we cannot alienate a particular group and allow them to be unhealthy and allow them to be oppressed and think we're going to live in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Those things do not go together. They never have, and they never will.
That's great. And I agree wholeheartedly. I also, because no one said it, go to pwn.org, pwn-usa.org and sign up for the Health Not Prisons Collective newsletter. That's a great way to stay connected to the work, because one of my favorite pastimes is scouring the internet for ways to support folks on the ground and uplift the work that's happening. So we would love to be that connector piece for anyone looking to get active. Tiffany, do you have any suggestions on ways folks can support sex workers or HIV decrim efforts?
You know, I think it can start with district attorneys' education. because they can choose whether or not to prosecute. But also when you get to the South, that gets tricky, because a lot of the times all the charges aren't so much because the DA agrees with it, but they've got to get voted back in. They've got to keep their job. So it takes a lot of groundwork, education, general community, connecting with the Sero, PWN networks, grassroots, and then also just not forgetting about the sex workers. I mean, reaching out to the areas where sex work is at, and, you know, seeing if condoms are needed, you know, what else stations can be set up. But as far as legal, it starts with the courts and legislation.
Oh, could I just mention one thing? I'm sorry. My background is civil rights law. And when this issue was not about sex workers, but about just being Black, it took the federal courts to actually come in with civil rights litigation. And the work that I mentioned about New York, that's how that case came about. There was a class action lawsuit filed in federal court. Section 1983 of Title 42 allows you to sue a state actor who has arrested you maliciously or prosecuted you maliciously. So the court system can also be used to hold states accountable. And that was one of the things I wanted to mention. When we have law enforcement officers or court officers who are acting in bad faith, we can hold them accountable in the court system. And we can also hold them accountable politically.
Yeah, I definitely believe there's a lot of work to be done in the courts. I also wanted to say something or uplift something Tiffany said about not forgetting sex workers and going and, you know, a message to nonprofits and people that work in other movement spaces is, you know, to not forget sex workers and to not buy into the stigma and the, you know, misinformation, and instead extend services and welcome, you know, sex workers into the fold of programming and outreach, etc. I want to turn to questions. I've seen a couple of them fly through the chat. And I know we had a little bit more time for the moderated portion, but I really do want to get to some of these that are being asked from our audience. But before we do that, I want to, you know, leave space. Is there anything else that our panelists would like to share before we move to audience questions?
I guess just one quick thing I want to share is, and Tiffany, I think you touched on this a little bit, was prosecutors actually do have the decision of what they're going to criminalize and what they're going to prosecute. And one tactic that we have seen effective in certain places is asking district attorneys to not prosecute sex work related arrests. And some people have come out very, very strongly in support of not prosecuting, and others have made a decision not to prosecute and have done it a lot quieter. But it's important that we recognize that at this point, that is a tactic that can be effective to keep people safe. So I know that it's happened in Michigan, and that prosecutor who did it, the district attorney, was actually very, very, very vocal about why we need to decriminalize sex work. And then there's been some stuff happening in New York as well, but I think it's important to uplift that as a tactic.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think activating all levers of power in order to stop the criminalization of folks for simply living their lives, for things like labor, it's important. So my first question from the audience is going to be, what are some of the most pressing areas to start trying to secure policy changes at the state and local levels, especially in red states, parishes, counties? So I guess what areas, what do you think is the most pressing area for policy change? I think decriminalization is like a big end goal, but are there immediate changes or policies that you would like to see created?
Well, for me, I feel like here in Arizona, changing the public view on sex work is very important. And that's how we can get policy change at the bigger level. Because right now, we're trying to get the decriminalization, not the decriminalization, but the manifestation bill thrown out. And so what we're trying to do is like educate the public on like the systemic racism involved into these manifestation laws and educate them on like, hey, these laws are targeted poor and Black and brown people in low income areas. And this is why these laws exist. And these are reminiscents of sundown laws that target Black and brown bodies. And so that we can get their support and get their support. So when we ask to get the petition signed to remove it off of the statute, that we have the public support on moving and getting rid of policies that directly impact sex workers and target sex workers.
I think it's really important to talk to people in those communities, sex workers who actually know what's going on, so they can actually share what would be effective and what people need. It's often like, I see a lot of national organizations or people who don't have as much experience on a local level trying to come in and say, this is what communities need, this is what's going to be effective. And I've never seen that work well. But when it's actual people who live there, work there, organize there, I think that's where we see the most possibility for progress.
Awesome. I think, Lynly, this would be another question that I'd love to start by having you answer is, what tactics have you found effective when trying to teach legislators the difference between trafficking and sex work?
It depends what the goal is. Sometimes I've worked with a lot of people who are really actually interested in telling their stories and what people have been through and why certain laws are actually really harmful to survivors of trafficking. For example, condoms as evidence, which I believe multiple people have mentioned. I worked with someone who was allowed 3 condoms a day. That was it, and having her be able to go and share her story about what trafficking looked like, and then the survival sex she engaged in afterwards was really helpful. I got feedback from the legislators that was really helpful for them to understand there is a difference and that the policies that we had in place were actually harming her while they were supposed to be protecting her. And so I think it's just really important to know what the goal is and just to break it down and know who the best messenger is. And then also not to put all of the work on people who are directly impacted and to be allies and making sure that when we're talking with legislators that it's a safe and comfortable environment, to be honest, because it isn't always. So always be aware of that. But I often just break it down, or I give them things to read, or I do my little spiel of how to make the perfect victim. And people seem to actually really relate to that for some odd reason, because they realize that their work has a direct impact on creating victimization.
Yeah, I think one of the, I don't even think it's one of the main points of this panel, because you guys have shared so much that has really like got my mind racing. But the criminalization of just like normal things, the criminalization of simply existing, that ultimately disconnects people from care, I think is something I want to make sure folks walk away understanding. When you are a sex worker, or by virtue of just any of your identities, you're criminalized, like punishable by law, which is kind of just an insane concept, and leads me to one of the other questions that was asked about breast or chest feeding your infant when you're undetectable. I would love for, we can start with anyone, but can anyone explain to me what I guess the issue with breast or chest feeding is when you are a person living with HIV. And Tiffany, I see you unmuted yourself, so go ahead.
The reason is because the CDC is not involving women. I'm seeing that we're not brought to the table when it comes to reproductive rights with HIV. So the studies, there isn't studies. There's amazing advocates that are doing independent, that are flooring with it. It's so exciting to watch. But for the rest of us, you know, I didn't get that opportunity. In the state of Tennessee, if you breastfeed, I would have been arrested. That is criminal. That is exposure to HIV. So it's on the books. There's just, women aren't brought to the table for HIV research. That's the problem with when it comes to breast milk. We know the facts. We see it, that I don't know if anyone follows a particular woman that I'm talking about, but I don't want to bring her name up with her not being on the panel, but HIV is not being passed by breast milk. When you're undetectable, you cannot pass HIV to your child. So the breast milk's being taken, it's being tested, and then being passed back to the mom, and all, you know, all is safe and good. But the problem is it's still going to be on the books legally because there's no higher efforts to place studies to prove that. So that's my spill on breast milk. It's the fact that I don't see women being brought to the table on many HIV research.
I have kind of a follow-up question. I definitely agree that folks need to be engaged and brought to the table, and in a meaningful way, not as just oh, well, there's a person sitting over there that checks that box, but meaningfully engaged and listened to. But how do we make spaces safer for sex workers, especially active sex workers, to join these kinds of efforts? Sometimes I know we, you know, in the HIV decriminalization spaces, I still believe like disclosing your status should be a personal choice. We shouldn't require folks to declare anything in order to be active participants in making change. Similarly, have folks seen you know, hesitancy for active sex workers to get engaged in the work because of what that could mean for safety? And how do we make these spaces safer? How do we make sure that when we are holding decision-making tables, we can actually have active sex workers and not cause harm or, you know, introduce violence into their lives?
One of the ways that SWAP does it is that we create leaders. We have peer mentorship groups. We create hubs. We go out into the community. We show visibility. We show intention. We are very high on integrity, and therefore, them seeing like the people that see me every day, my girls, I call them, that see me not every day but every weekend. They see this truck coming through. They know I have something for them, and they're gonna stop doing what they're doing just to see what I have, because it's about your intention. And that's how you create safe spaces and welcome sex workers in, because you have to gain their trust. We don't trust everybody. We don't. Trans people don't trust everybody. Sex workers don't trust everybody. So you have to be very intentional and show up.
I think that's an incredible piece of advice. I think, you know, not making these relationships for show or fake, but instead honoring the expertise and the, you know, experiences of sex workers. And I want to turn to, I'm sorry, does anyone else have anything else to add? Because I really do think making spaces safe for sex workers is actually very important, and we should pause here for a second. Monica, go ahead.
Yeah, I think making spaces, but also sex workers have been at the forefront of HIV policies since the beginning. And so recognizing the untold stories of sex worker rights activists during the height of HIV and how research and how in Australia, they were the main focus on using sex workers on safe sex practices, telling sex worker, hey, use condoms and tell your clients about condoms and everything else. And they were a tool to use as PrEP, telling people about PrEP and how to use condoms and everything else and not. And so I feel like sex workers in general have always been talking about HIV policy, HIV prevention, and making sure that everyone have access to condoms. And so I don't want to say like, hey, allow us now, but I think we should just recognize the work that we've been doing all this time.
That's yes, that's a very powerful reframe, because sex workers have been the leaders in these movement spaces, no matter what we're discussing, what topic. One of the audience questions was, how can we adequately compensate folks for being at the table? Oftentimes we're asking the most impacted to do too much free work when we are inviting them. So what does compensation look like?
Pay us our speaking fee. Just pay us a good speaking fee, right? And I think a lot of people will respect that, and a lot of sex workers respect that. Like, hey, just pay us to do this work. And this is not a labor of love, because if it was a labor of love, you don't ask someone who's a motivated speaker to speak for free, but you won't directly impact the people to speak for free so you can get paid. But pay us what we're worth, and everything else. So I feel like compensation looks like paying us. If you want to fly us out pretty good and get us a good hotel. Don't just give us in the Best Western, give us a good hotel.
Important detail. I support that. Yes, Ashunte, go ahead.
Not to mention, when we are on these panels, when we are in these discussions and we are speaking, what people don't understand is some of this stuff can be very triggering, traumatizing, or stuff that we've had buried. So when we do come to these tables, like who spoke before me, pay us what is due, because you don't understand the labor or the trauma that this lived experience is coming from. And you cannot forget that. When I open up my mouth, you can hear the passion, or you can hear the pain in my voice. So pay me and understand that this is painful. I want you to recognize that it's painful.
Yeah. Thank you for emphasizing that. I think it's critical to realize lived expertise, like you said, it comes from somewhere. It comes from the walk of life that you've, traversed this far. And that's powerful. And it means a lot more than folks, I believe, that study when it comes from your real life. And this question is actually kind of going back to our discussion of U equals U. So Tiffany, this is for you. Is your health department on board with U equals U? This person said in Ohio, they've created campaigns that are posted in the community. I think this was in reference to your comment that like U equals U on billboards would be great, a great thing to see in Tennessee.
I believe just recently, if I'm not mistaken, Tennessee Health Department did join in on a meeting, but as far as being vocal advocates, they're state employed, so that's really tricky. That billboards and all that would more or less, I'm not sure, would be sponsored by the health department, more of nonprofit organizations. But I do know the health department is aware, and there was a recent training all employees on the education of U equals U. But I think it runs kind of murky being in the South with the health department being willing to put their name, to attach that to a public service announcement. That would fall into a 501k just for this particular area. Yeah, but yes, the Tennessee department is on board.
U equals U is about 2 years old, I believe, or older. Because it's 2021. I lived in Atlanta. I moved here in 2019, and it had already been out in Atlanta, I know, before I moved here. The only thing that I have, and I want to say this for you all, and I hope you understand it. you equals you have been like really damaging in our communities, because instead of our numbers going down, they're rising, and that's due to the false narrative that you equals you has projected. People are already not wanting to practice safe sex. So when you equals you came out, it's like, okay, whatever. And it's creating like this bad space.
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of education that needs to happen both, you know, in the legislature, but also in the community about the facts of science and the like not like the protection that's provided to an individual is not the same as like the protection that's provided to everyone. I think that's what your comment was in reference to, like folks not, yeah, I think that's what your comment was in reference to. Okay. So does anyone else have, oh, Brianna, thank you, said U is not the end all be all. We have to partner science with human rights. Love that. Okay. I had another question, but now it's escaping me. Oh, the National HIV Strategic Plan, the NHAS, has recently come out. It came out on World AIDS Day. And so we had a question about the federal HIV response and have they responded to sex workers and their needs, or even, you know, this is the first time that sex workers were meaningfully mentioned in the strategy. And so do you feel like, Monica, I feel like I see you celebrating. So what's your feelings about the federal response?
So it's great, right? But it's the first time that we've been mentioned more than just a blur, but actually mentioned. But I think that they fall short when they don't call for decriminalization. And so, but it's really great to have like sex workers mentioned in this national HIV policy thing, right? Where for sex workers, it's acknowledging that we are here, but we want the policy to go further and stick your neck out for sex workers and say, hey, now let's push for decriminalization like the Lancet. And so in the discussion box, I'm gonna post our response to the national policy thing that came out. So I think it's very important.
I wanted to jump in on that question also. I think acknowledgement is great. I think it's amazing for this to be the first time, but I also think it's really sad that we have to celebrate being acknowledged as human. It just shows the state of affairs that we live in. And I think acknowledgement is not enough. I think we have to be careful about publicly celebrating someone's basic identification that you're human. I think we have to be really, really careful, because if that satisfies, then that's all that will ever happen. I think we have to gain ground. If we stop doing harm, and I think the federal government's first agenda item needs to stop doing harm because of the money interest involved in the anti-trafficking movement. Harm has been the loudest expression of the federal government. There's this whole thing that you could look at, FOSTA SESTA. There's this whole legal dinosaur, I will call it, that equips the court system with an opportunity to prosecute online businesses for what happens on their platforms. And there was money. There's always money behind these campaigns, right? But the most that the federal government has said before this statement came out was that if you allow sex work to happen on your platform, then you can be held to be criminally responsible. Well, that was one of the few places where sex workers had the opportunity to vet and screen clients and maintain safety and network between each other, which is what we're talking about, right? So I think one of the first things the federal government needs to do is acknowledge the role that it's played in making this so much tougher for people it should be helping. That's first. And then second, once you've acknowledged that, I think you need to draw, and we've said this several times, a clear distinction, because as New York has shown, you can at the same time create opportunities for sex workers to do their work and be respected as professionals, right? And at the same time, protect minors and those other individuals who need to be protected from human trafficking. You can do them both at the same time. Those are not competing agendas. And as I understand it, sex workers will be the first to tell you how important it is that they be protected from human trafficking. But that is not the common case. Most often, sex work, prosecution, and criminalization becomes another way to oppress marginalized communities. And we do it unapologetically.
And I just wanted to add something to what Chauncey just said. You know, SESTA FOSTA actually creates trafficking victims. Yep. It creates people to have to rely on third parties. It makes it more difficult for people to be able to negotiate, just as Chauncey just said. But it also actually takes away something that law enforcement also used to help find victims. And in general, most of the time, all of these like Backpage, as well as so many other sites that were supportive, actually tried to help find trafficking victims as well. So not only does it create trafficking victims, it also cuts a way out for trafficking victims to escape or to be found. So, you know, it's so horrible. It's not even counterintuitive. It's actually causing the problem that it's trying to stop. And it was created by people who aren't sex workers, people who are survivors of trafficking, who aren't even advocates, because even law enforcement didn't like this. Not that they could speak up loudly, but this was just, once again, another thing about morality, rather than actually caring about people who are actually affected.
And also, when you talk about Backpage, right, here in Arizona, especially in Phoenix, they had their court case, and the court case was declared a mistrial because they kept deflating sex work with human trafficking, and they thought that they can get away with it, but the judge declared a mistrial because they brought in all these traffic victims, but that's not what they were being charged on. And so I think for like Backpage and for Craigslist, it was a way for me to survive and not have the choice. If I wanted to go work the streets, I could, but I can do it in the safety and comfort of my home, where I knew where I was at. I knew I had access to condoms. I knew I had access to my neighbors if I was in trouble. And so I think for anybody who's engaging in sex work, having online platforms is very important. But what we also saw, and I want to give it up to all my sex workers out there, that when the online platforms gave out on us, we knew how to go back and make our money and survive. And so that shows the resilience of sex workers, trans women, women of color, and people engaged in sex work, that we are resilient individuals and we will thrive in this world no matter what you throw at us.
Once again, I'm hearing the thread of criminalization cutting off people's connection to safety, and also, you know, formal pipelines or systems that can keep people safe en masse. Also, that sex workers have the answers if we just listen to the expertise that has been shared for years. Because I also know groups have tried to get the NHAS to list sex workers as a priority population, not just acknowledge their humanity and their existence, but list them as a priority population for years. And so the brilliance, the expertise, the leadership exists. And to Chauncey's point, if the federal government can stop actively doing harm and instead listen to the brilliance, we would be in a much better place. So with our remaining 5 minutes, I just wanted to give an opportunity. We kind of touched on it in the beginning, but what does justice look like in the sex work and HIV decriminalization movements? You can give a sentence, you can give a paragraph. I also want to flag that some great conversation has been going on in the chat, and also a lot of resource sharing and links to support sex workers financially. So, 'tis the season to give, and this is a very important place where you can impact the world for better, quite honestly. But once again, what does justice look like in this movement?
I would say empowerment and safety is what justice would look like for sex workers, for the laws to be decriminalized.
We've been talking a lot about decriminalization, but I think we should also talk about decarceration for people who have already been involved. And also, as several states are beginning to talk about being able to expunge your criminal record, to be able to have those records sealed so that they won't be impediments for you getting safe housing, healthcare, or benefits. I think also in this pandemic, we should find a way to give sex workers the same aid that other workers get. Right now, most situations, if you are engaged in what they consider to be immoral behavior, you are not eligible for any relief. That could be changed and should be changed.
Sex work is work. So all the same protections and opportunities. I also saw somebody in the chat say access to business loans and pathways to independence. But Lynly or Monica or Ashunte want to share what you think justice in this movement space would look like?
Access to housing. I think everybody knows that like housing is very important and it's housing first, but what are organizations doing to provide housing? Because in Arizona, the housing market is going up, and places where trans women could afford to live are dwindling, and we need safety. And so I think how you support is support organizations that are providing housing for trans women, sex workers. Make sure if you are a person with a property that you are renting out, making sure that you make sure it's safe for trans women to live there. Make sure you're not overcharging sex workers or trans women or kicking them out because you find out that there are sex workers in your house. So just make sure that sex workers and trans people have safe places to live.
I think it's really hard for me to figure out what justice would be. I think step one would be to get rid of and to decriminalize sex work, to decriminalize HIV status. But I also think that, unfortunately, God willing, we will be able to do that. We will be able to decriminalize and get rid of those horrific laws. But I don't have a lot of faith that that won't stop profiling with other things like trespass, like disorderly conduct. So, I really struggle with what justice looks like. I can tell you what I think the first step needs to be, but I think until we get rid of prisons in general, I think I don't fully know the answer.
I appreciate that honesty. I think that a lot of us in movement spaces are, dealing with, we can take the first step, we can push towards justice, but, until we're all free, we're not really free. And so I really do appreciate that comment. And yeah, we have hit, I believe, the end of our time together. Does anyone have any closing thoughts? I really appreciate all the expertise and brilliance that's been shared. And I hope folks take advantage of, the resources shared in the chat and connect with us continuing into the future. All right, well, enjoy your holiday season, everyone. Let's talk about sex again in the new year.